I'm going to start off by saying I am fully aware that teaching today's session with my accent is the definition of chutzpah, right? Because I'm taking on probably the Jewish American woman poet. In fact, I would say the first modern Jewish cultural figure in America. I don't normally teach American literature. My speciality is very much British and European Jewish literature. And I do a lot of kind of European Jewish heritage tours, and you're going to get a little glimpse of that as we go along, because I love as we tour, kind of uncovering the Jewish side of stories we think we knew in the arts and cultural world. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at Sarah Bernhardt, the photographer Claude Cahun, and in fact Virginia Woolf, but through a specifically Jewish lens. Today is slightly different. Today is me bringing my British academic expertise to bear on a story of a Jewish figure and what I would say is a Jewish text. Um, as I'm going to kind of talk about as we go through, part of my awareness of this poem actually comes from Emma Lazarus's time in London. Um, we're all aware I'm going to be talking about the new Colossus, which is the poem on the Statue of Liberty. And I'm going to contextualize it quite a lot before we start. Um, but what you may not know is that she wrote the poem not long after her first trip to Europe. She then returned to Europe and she put together the collection, which was actually published posthumously because she died not long after she put the collection together. And she chose this as the opening poem. So actually, the creation of this poem came out of her engagement with European and British writers and European culture, although it was a very specifically Jewish American statement. So I feel like that's kind of my approach to it. Although, as you're going to see, I began thinking about it, and then I went away and had a bit of a look in our British Library archives. When Trump's first term happened, and there was some rhetoric on TV, on particularly CBS News, on one of my trips to the States, which cited this poem when they were talking about immigration policy. So, considering what is happening today, I know you may have just woken up to the news, but I've been kind of seeing it coming through for several hours. It feels very fitting to be looking at this and looking at what that poem is saying about immigration in context of the current moment. Although, as you'll see, I kind of started collecting images and thinking about it, um, gosh, over 10 years ago now. So let me start. I'm going to share my screen, um, and let me just make sure, yeah, sharing sounds and everything. And I want to start by kind of looking at the Statue of Liberty and where it is. We all know it's the kind of entry, isn't it, to New York? It's where the boats come in. Shirelle was asking me earlier before introducing me how to pronounce my surname, and I said Dautch, but Deutsch, it doesn't really matter. The reason it doesn't matter is because the majority of my family are Dautch, and the majority of my family are in America, having come on boats in exactly the period I'm going to be talking about, traveling past this statue, and it was the first thing that they saw as they arrived. In fact, my grandfather was the sole member of my father's family to stay in Britain, and somehow he thought slightly anglicising the surname would stop him being perceived as a dangerous immigrant. I think he should have maybe anglicised it further. I'm not quite sure it achieved what he wanted. But that's why my surname is slightly odd. And that is the kind of narrative that we're looking at today. We're thinking about the state of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe to America in the late 1880s, because that's the context of the poem being placed on the Statue of Liberty. So that's the background, but we've also got the modern day context. So I want to start by showing you a few images, because for the last few years I've been collecting, and I've only got a few here, but I actually have hundreds. I've been collecting caricatures and cartoons using the Statue of Liberty. So we have this one, which was from the end of the first term. We've got all sorts of Trump ones. These are from between 2016 to 2020. We've got Der Spiegel. Those were all American ones. We've got Der Spiegel, the German magazine, getting it in on the act with America First in 2017 and Make America Great Again with Biden in 2020. Now, although this is a kind of political session around immigration, I'm not kind of using my own political views, but what I want to show you is when there are comments that are made politically about America, how often the Statue of Liberty is used to make those comments. And actually, that goes back a long way, and it is across the world. This is Der Spiegel. Here are a few more. This is the most recent one I found. But this I took on the day of the election results in 2024. I was in Nice. I was on the harbour in Nice, and you can just see the palm tree, can't you, above? And what you're seeing is a small statue. This is cast from one of the original maquettes for the Statue of Liberty, and it is on the other shore. So I'm not sure if you're aware of that. We have the big Statue of Liberty in New York on the harbour, but several of the original designs that Bartholdi made were turned into statues and are dotted around France. And this one in Nice Harbour is iconic. And what I found fascinating was when the election results came out, someone did some kind of art intervention and put a dollar bill across her mouth, as in liberty has been being bought by money. So there is something about this icon and imagery that is being politicized and used for comment in the current moment in America, but also throughout Europe. And actually, that's not new. That's been going on since the moment the statue was first sculpted. So I want to give you a few comments from quite early on in the statue's life. So in 1886, just as the Bartholdi statue was being brought to New York, this is what the Cleveland Gazette, which is an African American newspaper, published. Shove the Bartholdi, it was sculpted by Frederick Bartholdi, shove the Bartholdi statue, torch and all, into the ocean until the liberty of this country is such as to make it possible for an inoffensive and industrious coloured man in the South to earn a respectable living for himself and family without being Ku Klux, perhaps murdered, his daughter and wife outraged, and his property destroyed. The idea of the liberty of this country, and this is an important quotation, enlightening the world, or even Patagonia, is ridiculous in the extreme. So the Cleveland Gazette, at the time of the statue being brought to America, saw that this was being created as an image, and an image, the tagline that was being used was an image of America enlightening the world. And immediately there was comeback. And in fact, that has continued. So I've been showing you recent political images about the presidency, but actually there is a whole series of images using the Statue of Liberty within the narrative of civil rights and abolition rights. And if any of you have been to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and American History in Philadelphia. So this is a photograph that I took there last year. You can see they have one of the very original images of the Statue of Liberty. This was one of the first photographs that was taken. And in front of it, they've hung a tapestry by Faith Ringgold, where the Statue of Liberty has been reimagined as a black woman, and all the slaves are drowning around her. So there is this use of this image to make political comment going back to 1886, but also within all sorts of different communities. And lest you think that this was the only negative take on the Statue of Liberty, there was an equally just one contemporaneous with the Cleveland Gazette. So this is a magazine called Judge. This is just a few years later. This is 1890. And the Statue of Liberty ain't looking very happy, is she? She's turning away. I don't know if you can see that. I've got an image of her close-up of her face here. She's looking away, she's sniffing, very unhappy, holding her torch away. And what you see here at her feet around the island is a proposed emigrant dumping site. Okay. So actually underneath it, at the bottom of the cartoon, the caricature that is on the front page of a really widely read magazine, the line says, Mr. Wisdom, so presumably this is Mr. Wisdom over here, if you are going to make this island into a garbage heap, I am going back to France. And of course, these immigrants that are being caricatured here, you can see the flag here says European garbage. They're all Jewish. Okay. So the Statue of Liberty, we nowadays think of being open, being accepting. But the original perception of her was absolutely the opposite, that she was standing for American values given by the French, that was kind of self-satisfied. It was kind of, the statue was given 100 years on after the revolution to announce how far America had come, and that it was not an opening of the gates, but a closing of them. That she was kind of the barricade, was how she was seen in the 1880s and 1890s. And for the Black community, she was guiding Europeans in, but letting everyone else drown. For the American community, she was going to go back to France because she should be actually closing the doors, not opening them, because who were these floods of European, mostly Jewish immigrants who were coming to the islands off New York and into New York itself and taking over the city. And that's the rhetoric you see throughout. So we've got this really politicized statue. And all this, both the Cleveland Gazette and Judge, are happening before the poem, but all the modern images are after the poem. Because the reason Emma Lazarus is described as the Jewess who ruined the US is she takes this statue, who is thought of as about enlightenment, republic, and a celebration of America, and she turns her into, quote, mother of exiles. So for many people, this is a wonderful thing. And for others, what she is doing in rewriting with this poem, rewriting the American approach to immigration, is ruining America. So we've got this really controversial figure who I'm calling the beautiful Jewess, even though that's the European term, because the beautiful Jewess is meant to be someone brilliant, someone admirable, enticing, seductive, but also someone incredibly dangerous. And by the way, that epithet could be used for the statue itself. I'll come to that in a few minutes. I want to go back a little bit. So we have this, I've just done a kind of 100 years of images of the Statue of Liberty being used in political framing. But I want to go back to the 1990s. So we were in the 1890s. We're going forward to the 1990s, about 30 years ago from where we are now, and the film Clueless. And I love the film anyway. And of course, it's a rewriting of a Jane Austen novel. But it has in it a Jane Austen novel called Emma. So there's a lovely little link there. But it has in it a kind of perfect summary of how America now views the Statue of Liberty and its role in immigration. So let me play this for you.
Should all oppressed people be allowed refuge in America? Amber will take the con position. Cher will be pro. Cher, 2 minutes.
So, okay, like right now, for example, the Haitians need to come to America. But some people are all, what about the strain on our resources? But it's like, when I had this garden party for my father's birthday, right? I said RSVP because it was a sit-down dinner. But people came that, like, did not RSVP. So it was, like, totally buttoned. I had to haul ass to the kitchen, redistribute the food, squish in extra place settings. But by the end of the day, it was like, the more, the merrier. And so, if the government could just get to the kitchen, rearrange some things, we could certainly party with the Haitians. And in conclusion, may I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty. Thank you very much.
Okay. So even Cher chewing gum with her audience of teenage dropouts know about the Statue of Liberty. And at that point, the debate is about Haitian immigration, but they are cheering this idea of an open America. And that was kind of a really iconic use of immigration and the Statue of Liberty, but it was making a debate about public resources. I'm going to show you the clip that I'm putting opposite that now, okay? Because when she says it doesn't say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty, obviously what it does say is welcome those who need you. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. So it's saying, welcome, come, we'll find the resources, we'll find the space, we'll find the food, we'll find the money. It seems really obvious. It seems really obvious to Alicia Silverstone's Cher character. And it seems really obvious to those people who completely repudiated Emma Lazarus that that was the argument the poem was making. We need to welcome all who need, all immigrants who need. But what got me researching and thinking about whether that's what the poem was really saying was the following news clip that I saw in the first Trump presidency. So I'm going to play you this, and I'm playing you this because it's a completely different interpretation of the poem. And that's going to be my prelude, because then what we're going to do for the rest of the session is unpick Lazarus's life and the poem to see which of the two meanings she's really writing. Okay, so this is CBSN.
So the Trump administration is defending its latest immigration policy after facing backlash for the impact that it will have on hundreds of thousands of low-income legal immigrants. During an interview with NPR, the acting U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Director responded to criticism that the move is in blatant disregard of an American ethos inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, taking in the poor instead. Ken Cuccinelli offered perhaps a reinterpretation of that poem, saying, quote, "Give me your tired and your poor, who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge." Well, he doubled down on that stance later on CNN.
Well, of course, that poem was referring back to people coming from Europe, where they had class-based societies, where people were considered wretched if they weren't in the right class. And it was introduced, it was written 1 year 1 year after the first federal public charge rule was written that says, and I'll quote it, "Any person unable to take care of himself without becoming a public charge," unquote, would be inadmissible.
Those comments quickly drew sharp scrutiny from Democrats. In a tweet, presidential candidate and former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke wrote, quote, "This administration finally admitted what we've known all along. They think the Statue of Liberty only applies to white people."
Okay. So we've got a really interesting political debate that is about the imagery of the Statue of Liberty, but is more about the words on the Statue of Liberty and the poem, which seem to symbolize what the statue is now thought of, the American ethos. And Cuccinella's perspective is that that poem was written only about immigrants from Europe, European immigrants. And because it was written after a law was passed saying immigrants could stay in America as long as they were not a public charge, as long as they were not causing American taxpayers to have to subsidize them, that actually Emma Lazarus's intentions were not just to have completely open borders and let anyone in, and that actually Alicia Silverstone's using it for the Haitians was a misreading of the poem. Now, it's a much more subtle reinterpretation of the Statue of Liberty and the poem on it, isn't it? Than just she's the Jewess who ruined the US and this whole thing is wrong. And it got me thinking, because he's absolutely right at one level. She was writing this in a context where she was talking about Jewish immigrants from Europe. So what I wanted to do was kind of look at her life, look at what she was doing in the literary construction of the poem, and say, do we have any insight into whether her meaning was literally, it's important to let these Jewish immigrants in, or if she was talking about an American ethos as a whole? So that's where we're going.
So the
Okay. And just to really back up what I mean, and that just give you the kind of proof texts. So in 1860, so let's start with Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus is born in 1849. In 1860, these are the statistics of the top 10 sources of immigrants to New York. So you can see Ireland is the top, and there's about 200,000. Then you've got German states. These are mostly not Jewish, but within them there are a few German immigrants. So there are waves of immigration to New York Jewishly. The immigrants who are Jewish immigrants who start off there have mostly come from South America on our Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi. Lazarus's own family is from Recife. She's 5th generation immigrant, and they are very well established, mostly quite wealthy, and they are of a different class status. In 1860, there are a few Jews coming from Germany, mostly men, because there is a shift in the law about Jewish men being allowed to marry and to vote. And it's about how much money you have, your occupation, and it's very, very restrictive. And you get all these educated Jewish men who decide they're going to try and make their way to the New World. So that's kind of the first small wave of Ashkenazi immigration. But actually, we're talking just a few thousand of that 100,000+. Then you've got England, Scotland, France, Canada, Switzerland, Poland, Italy, West Indies. Pretty much none of them are Jewish. That's 1860. 1880, 81, there is a big sea change in Russia. And between 1883 and 1887, there's the first wave of pogroms. Now, Steve Zipperstein, other people, Natan Meir, real experts in European Jewish history, can take that on, because there's a whole debate of what is and what isn't a pogrom. There's a debate about economic migration. You know, there's all sorts of things. Who is fleeing conscription? How many people died during this time? whether this was a wave of pogroms that was instigated from the top or whether it was actually coming from resentment amongst the various Russian and Ukrainian communities who were jealous of the Jewish status in the Pale of Settlement. That's for another session. But what I will say is by 1910, per year, almost 500,000 immigrants were coming from Russia, and almost all of them were Jewish. Okay, so in the 1880s alone, as a result of that first wave of pogroms, about 1,700,000 Ukrainian, Russian, Polish Jews came to America through that New York immigration pathway. And just to give you the contrast figure to Europe, to Western Europe, in the same time, you're talking about 240,000. So over a decade, you're getting huge differences. You're getting almost 2 million. And you can see by 1910, you're getting almost 500,000 a year from, and Russia, of course, by this point is a much broader image. You get signed if you're Russian, if you're from Lithuania, if you're from Poland, you know, if you're from Moldova, you're counted as Russian. So there is this massive Eastern European immigration to New York. And you can see, I mean, just across that 50-year period, the annual kind of foreign-born versus population, how it's shifting. You know, the population, first of all, the foreign-born population, the immigrant population is growing hugely, but also that immigrant population is having generations of children and grandchildren. So the total population is growing, and of that 4,766,000 of the total population, many of them by 1910 are descendants of those immigrants who were coming in the 1880s. So it's massive, this change. And when we say that she is taking on European immigration, she is absolutely in the centre of a firestorm, because when she is born and in her early years, up to about 1860, she is living where she's in a kind of rarefied world. Lazarus is in a brownstone in New York. She's one of 7 children to a very wealthy Jewish parents. She's educated. So again, for a woman, she's getting quite a rarefied experience. She's one of 6 sisters, and then there's a brother. And all those 6 sisters are educated in multiple languages, in literature, in science. The father absolutely dotes on the girls. They are, as I said, 5th generation. They're living within a small Sephardi Jewish community. So in the beginning, although there is a sense of anti-Semitism, in terms of class, they're quite comfortable. And certainly in terms of female experience, she feels that she's like, her childhood is one of the best kind of experiences a woman of that time could have. You get these floods of European immigrants, and with them, waves of anti-Semitism. And the Sephardi community becomes very split, because it becomes their responsibility to acclimatise and absorb these European Jews who are not American born, but actually they have different languages, different culture. They're Ashkenazi, they speak Yiddish, they speak Russian, they speak Polish. You know, they're not the Sephardi upper classes. She's in a very interesting position because a lot of her community are hugely resentful and feel that their identity is being threatened. She, being brought up by this very enlightened father, has been taught German, I mean literary German, but she uses it to go and try and communicate with the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi immigrants, and she does huge amounts of volunteering. So she is absolutely on the ground floor of bringing these waves of immigrants in. And that's what she writes the new Colossus out of. So it's November 1883. It's just been a year or two of a massive wave of immigration. She's in her 20s. and she's established. So her first book of poetry was actually published when she was 17. Her father funded it. He collected 200 of her poems and paid for it to be turned into a published volume. It wasn't widely distributed, but it was used to be sent to leading figures of the age, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, who corresponded with her and became something of a mentor, although he was also very difficult with her. He didn't approve of either her Jewishness or her femaleness, but she was a person. You know, by this point, actually, she'd published those 200 poems. She'd published several books of translations since. She was someone. A woman called Constance Cady Harrison came to her at the end of October and said to her, I want you to write a poem that I'm going to use for an auction. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And Emma Lazarus said no. And Constance Harrison turned round to her and goes, it's for the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is the first thing all these immigrants you're working with will see as they come in through the harbour. And Emma Lazarus went, ah. And apparently, according to Constance Harrison's diaries, she came back 2 days later with this manuscript. So it only took her 2 days to write. She'd initially refused, but the minute it was suggested to her that it was something that could be done in context of the European immigration, European Jewish immigration, she said, yes, I'm going to do it. And the idea clicked. So it was 2 days to write, but it was a long time behind that brewing. So we'll come later to the plaque. She wrote it in manuscript form. She never got to see it put as a plaque on the statue itself. This was put posthumously. But you can see she died in 1887. She'd written it in 1883. She died just a few years later, probably from Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was definitely some kind of cancer, and that's what, diagnosing backwards, the doctors now think it probably was. That poem that was written in 2 days becomes a plaque. One of her friends, Grace Schuyler, pays for it to go up on the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. And that is what shifts the whole consciousness of the statue. So let's have a look at how this statue, in 1905, when the plaque is put on it, gets to this point, and how the poem gets to the point. Let's start with the man who comes up with the idea. So his name is Edward de la Boulaye. He's a lawyer. He's a constitutional fellow in France. He's an abolitionist, and he himself is a poet. So he has this idea that there should be a connection between France and America. He's chair of the French Anti-Slavery Society. He's very aware of the abolitionist movement in America. He's written a 3-volume work on the political history of the United States. I'm not the only European who is presumptuous enough to talk about American history. And during the American Civil War, he becomes the head of the French Emancipation Committee, and he develops this idea of presenting America with a gift, because France has been through a revolution, America is going through one too. Let's give them a gift. He speaks to a sculptor, Frederick August Bartholdi, who is a very well-known sculptor, and in fact has sculpted Laboulaye himself. So you can see these are early maquettes in Bartholdi's studio. But Laboulaye is the idea man. Bartholdi makes it work, but the idea comes from the poet and the constitutional scholar. Bartholdi is the pair of hands and the creative. Absolutely, I'm not denying his artistry, but it's very much a conversation between them. And what they talk about is two things. One is how to make it work and how to make it big, okay? And then the other is what it's going to say. So how to make it work and how to make it big needs not just a sculptor, but an engineer. So a third man comes into the conversation, and that is Gustave Eiffel of the Eiffel Tower. And the Statue of Liberty, I don't think many people realise, is also a response to the Eiffel Tower. Bartholdi, Laboulaye and Eiffel want it to be America's grand statement, America's Eiffel Tower. And in fact, you can even see in the arm that holds the torch, it has some of the same engineering at a slant as the Eiffel Tower has as well. So it's three people together. So they've decided they're going to do a big symbolic statement. They know how to engineer it, but what quite is it going to say? Well, what they base it on, and again, this is really Laboulaye's idea, is Marianne, the French Lady Liberty. But they make a few changes. They swap her red French cap, that is the revolutionary cap. They swap it for the crown, okay? And they swap the flag for the torch, okay? Because this is not meant to be a nationalistic statement. This is meant to be a global one. And the torch is exactly because of that phrase, enlightening the world. So they're taking a very revolutionary, well-known French symbol. Again, I'm going to speed on because I've only got about 10 more minutes, but this could have like a whole hour's discussion in itself. They take this absolutely French symbol, this is a Delacroix painting, and they turn it into what they foresee not as an American but as a global symbol. And you can see here in the early shaping, it's slightly different. The arm ends up slightly more at an angle. Her face actually ends up being refined. And what I think is really interesting is the model that he uses for the French woman, for the Statue of Liberty. It's the French woman. In the beginning, people think it's Bartholdi's wife, but it isn't. It's a woman called Eugénie Boyer, who will go on and marry into the Singer family, as in the Singer sewing machine. So the Statue of Liberty is literally a Jewish woman. Okay. Whether or not Emma Lazarus is aware of that, I'm not sure, but she's certainly aware that it is the first thing being seen by these European immigrants. The other really important thing of Bartholdi and Laboulaye and Eiffel's premise, but really again this is coming from Laboulaye, is that America needs to contribute. This is the newspaper of them bringing the statue over, but I don't know if you can see, it's just the statue itself. They want there to be an American contribution, and so they say that the pedestal of the statue has to be funded in America, but the government won't stump up. So this pedestal that you see here is actually publicly funded. And that public funding is the idea of a group of women, a group of New York established women, one of whom is Constance Cady Harrison, who is the friend of Emma Lazarus. What they decide, Emma Lazarus isn't in on this initial conversation, but what they decide is they'll do all sorts of other ways of raising money. They'll put money in themselves, they'll go to philanthropists, they will do a charity auction, but they will also try and make it a public project to make the public of New York buy in. So they ask everyone to give a tiny amount, even half a penny. They collect money, they make it a big public fundraising campaign where they say even the poorest to the wealthiest is part of making this project happen. That public campaign is wonderful and it does buy in a lot of support, but it doesn't get enough money. So they come up with the idea for the charity auction. And you can see here, actually, we've got, sorry, I had forgotten I'd done this. They put in an advert in the New York Times beforehand where it says a volunteer committee composed of the leading ladies here is actively engaged in receiving contributions to the fund for the erection of the Bartholdi pedestal. The committee will not solicit large subscriptions, the limit being 10 cents each. The territory from Nantucket to Pittston, a distance of 20 miles, will be worked up, and it is expected that a very large sum of money will be raised. The principals in all the public schools will take an interest in the matter and aid in swelling the fund. So there is a real public ethos here. But there's also the need for a charity fundraising auction. They do need to get big philanthropists to throw some money in. So what you can see is at the bottom of this draft of the sonnets, you can see it's written in aid of the Bartholdi Pedestal Fund. Okay. She knows these women, they are part of the same ethos as her. They're putting their energy into raising money for the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. She's putting her money and her energy into creating circumstances to help the poor, and I'm talking real impoverished European immigrant refugees. So why is she doing this? She's a privileged woman. She could be doing the kind of charitable fundraising for the Bartholdi Pedestal Committee that everyone else is. But she's all the way through from childhood, she's had a slightly different edge. And I'm very aware I've only got about 7 or 8 minutes, so I'll be quick. I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. You know, I said her father published those 200 poems from when she was 14 to 17. One of them was an elegy for one of his friends who'd been killed in the Civil War. But what she wrote in that elegy was not about the grief of him dying in the battle. She actually said that the legacy of war itself is not victory, but grief. You know, she wasn't cheering outcome. She was mourning all those on both sides who died. When Lincoln was assassinated, everyone else writes elegies to Lincoln. She writes a poem from the perspective of the mother of John Wilkes Booth, grieving the fact that her son is buried somewhere she doesn't know. She doesn't know how he's died, and he is the public enemy. She's always got an eye out from another perspective. It's not political, it's about a grieving mother. She's written about Goethe. She translated him, but then she rewrites him. Goethe wrote a whole series of love poems to a woman who he basically fell in love with and then never married and ran off. She takes the perspective of going, what happens to this woman who he abandoned? And she's been ruined and she's not able to marry anyone else and she's villainized in the public. So she then writes a poem from her perspective. There's always a slight counterculture punching back. This is one of my most interesting ones. This is slightly later. Again, she's just growing up. She's growing into her identity. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has written a poem about the Jewish cemetery at Newport. And at the end, he mourns. He says there was great traditions of the past, but what once has been shall be no more. Okay, the groaning earth in travail and pain brings forth its races, but does not restore, and the dead nations never rise again. He's talking about the Jews dead. You know, the biblical nations are never going to rise. She mourns the people. She's not mourning the big background figures, the patriarchs and the prophets. She's mourning the weary ones, the sad and the suffering. You can begin to hear echoes, can't you, in 1871 of what will go into the Statue of Liberty poem. Children's gladness and men's gratitude. And she ends it by saying, the sacred shrine is holy yet. Okay, that Jewish synagogue in Newport is still holy. And her whole project is about becoming a modernizing Jew. Again, there's a whole other session there on what she means by being a modern Jew. But she's always taking a slightly different tack. She's not afraid of rewriting great men's work. She translates Heine, the Jewish German poet, but she does the first translation of him into English. It's a big seller. It's really important. And yet she takes him on because he had converted to Christianity to try and get a position he never does at a university. And he regrets it. He regrets leaving Judaism. And she, again, very much takes the stance that she wants to be a modern, literate person, but she wants to stay a Jew. So all of this is there. And then there is her volunteer work. I'm sure you all know about Hayas, Well, at this point, it was HAES, the Hebrew Emigrant Aid Society. This is what HAES comes out of. And Emma Lazarus is one of their first volunteers. And she's not just critical of the government and how they treat the refugees, but she's even critical of the Schiff, the Jewish Schiff family, who are funding the shelter of them because of the conditions it's being left in. So she is absolutely on the ground. So this is all what's going on in her head. She's got all these literary translations. She's got her time. She's just come back from a holiday in Europe. She's got this rewriting of important male poets. She's got this notion of it's not the important people, but it's the daily, everyday person. And she is surrounded by immigrants. And Constance Cady Harrison has said to her, write about the Statue of Liberty as the first thing that these immigrants you're volunteering with will see as they come into the harbour. And this is the poem she writes. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, the colossus that was one of the seven wonders of the world. This is again her not. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing the patriarchs. I'm not doing the big statues. Instead, this is what she's doing. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbour that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Okay, incredible. Here's the colossus that it's not. Instead, there's the woman that it is, Mother of Exiles. I've broken it down here so you can see it's a sonnet. It has a rhyme scheme. It is 8 and then 6 lines. It is an octave and a sestet. The octave is made of 2 4-line, what are known as envelope stanzas. So it's an A, B, B, A rhyme scheme. And then the sestet is alternating. I'm just showing you that again on each of these things. I could do an hour session, but what I want to show you is it's a European sonnet. It's not a British sonnet, which are 4, 4, 4 and a rhyming couplet. That's what Shakespeare writes. She's writing it deliberately in a European form. Everything she does has a message. And she's rewriting another poem. So when she was in England, she came to the British Museum. And this was a poem that was written in response to one of the Egyptian statues in the British Museum by Percy Bysshe Shelley, who funnily enough is buried in exactly the same cemetery as Goethe, who she'd also translated. And I think she'd probably been to the cemetery to see them both. And it's a poem many of you may know, Ozymandias. It's looking at how statues fall apart. You can build a statue of yourself to increase your reputation, but it ultimately won't last. Look on my works, you mighty, and despair is the intention. But actually what remains is not the statue, but the words on the pedestal. Okay. Here's the original poem. There's a competition that is written, that it's written for. That's the newspaper she saw it in. There is Percy Bysshe Shelley's gravestone that she probably saw when she saw Goethe's. But I just want to show you the correspondences between the poems to prove my point. The pedestal, the colossal wreck. This is where the new Colossus comes from. If you put the two poems side by side, can you see the rhyme scheme? Land command, land command. Okay. She is absolutely taking what Shelley does and transfiguring it. he quotes, his is the very first example of a sonnet which quotes reported speech. He gives Ozymandias words, or rather the words are on the pedestal. She puts the words into the mouth of the female statue. Okay. The rhyme scheme, he is an established poet. He can get away with playing with the rhyme scheme and not getting everything quite exact. She actually, and again, if I had lots of time, I'd go into it, but she is absolutely meticulous to the sonnet form. It's a very, very beautifully done piece. But the really important thing that I want to show you is that this is the phrase that we should all be thinking about. The wretched refuse. That's why, on one hand, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, people have argued that it's, it should be open to everyone. It's including the Haitians, it's including the poor, it's including those who are public charge. But they've just based that on a reading of the poem itself. What I want to show you is the wretched refuse is not what you think it is. In American dialect, not in British. British, we don't use trash and refuse, we use rubbish. But that dialect of refuse for rubbish actually partially comes from her. She means those who are refused, those who everywhere else had refused. And I can prove it. Because can you see that this is sonnet 1? When she puts it together, when she returns to London and in 1887 is putting her new book of sonnets together to be published, she's getting very ill. She knows it's going to be published after her death. This is the poem she puts with it as sonnet 2, okay? And it's called 1492. She is a Spanish and Portuguese refugee. This is her history. Her family originally were exiled. And this is what she does. Thou two-faced year, mother of change and fate, did weep when Spain cast forth with flaming sword the children of the prophets of the Lord. Prince, priest, and people spurned by zealot hate, hounded from sea to sea, from state to state. The West refused them, and the East abhorred. No anchorage the known world could afford. Close locked was every port, barred every gate. Then smiling thou unveiled, so two-faced year, a virgin world, where doors of sunset part, saying, Ho, all who weary enter here. There falls each ancient barrier that the art of race or creed or rank devised to rear grim bulwarked hatred between heart and heart. The West refused them. When she said the wretched refuse, she's actually also referring to her ancestors who the West had refused. And what she's saying is those who have been refused everywhere else have a home in this virgin world, America. I don't even need to make a play on refuse to do it. It says it in this poem. Every race or creed or rank devised, all those barriers that rears hatred should be knocked down because America welcomes them all. She dies. She's written both these poems. She dies. These poems are not well known. They're published, but they've got a small audience. And then her friend Grace Schuyler wants to commemorate her and puts the placard up on the pedestal. And what happens is the words she's given to the Statue of Liberty, Mother of Exiles, become its defining moment. They define the American ethos. And it's 1905 when that placard goes up, which is when Theodore Roosevelt is creating new laws about immigration or not. And actually, although he does keep the public charge things, his immigration laws are much weaker than the 1880s. And he is, and this is again a whole other session, he is much more open to the European Jewish emigrants, and he takes this poem as his creed. So when Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was the source of her poem, said poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, I don't know if either he or Emma Lazarus realised they were talking absolutely about her. I'm going to end at that point. I'm so sorry I've run over by a few minutes, but I hope that's okay. And Shirelle, over to you.
That is, let me just, it's more than okay, and actually really fascinating that you ended up answering some of the questions that came. One of them was actually about that phrase, the wretched refuse. So you kind of answered the questions, and since we are out of time, and thank you for an amazing session, maybe I'll just ask you to say a few words about what's waiting for us next week.
Okay, my pleasure. So next week, I'm taking on more of Sarah Bernhardt's life than I am her theatrical work. I'm taking on that too, but actually something very interesting. I don't know if anyone was reading the New York Times today, but there was an article about the grandchildren of Captain Alfred Dreyfus from the Dreyfus Affair, because he's finally going to be included in the Pantheon. So what I'm looking at is the Dreyfus Affair and French anti-Semitism. And by the way, some of the figures I'd mentioned in this talk come up here, but about how Sarah Bernhardt becomes not just the most famous actress in the world, and again comes from France to America, a bit like La Boulier, who she knows, but she also becomes the most famous Jew in the world because she's one of the few people to speak out publicly supporting Dreyfus. That's next week. Claude Cahun, carrying on from her, is a French Jew who also knows Bernhardt and Dreyfus, leaves France because of anti-Semitism, ends up in the Channel Islands on the only British territory the Nazis invade, and leads the resistance against them. And then we're going to end up with Virginia Woolf, because Virginia Woolf is not Jewish and many people fear her, but she is married to Leonard Woolf, who is not only Jewish, but he takes her with him to Nazi Germany in the 1930s because he is going to write and publish the first big anti-Nazi creed in Britain. And Virginia Woolf is part of that. So that's where we'll kind of look at a whole other appreciation of her.